Thank you, Mia Thornton and Miss Gwendolyn Carr, mother of Eric Garner, for this invitation to be here today. It's an honor and it's a privilege to be here with some of my angel moms and my angel dad and other family members that are here today. We often say that we are a club, a sorority of which we didn't pledge nor ever wanted to be a part of. My name is Marion Gray-Hopkins, and I am the co-founder of the Coalition of Concerned Mothers, the executive director. But more importantly, I'm here today as the voice of Gary Hopkins Jr., whose voice was stolen. His life was stolen to police violence. Gary Hopkins Jr., whom we affectionately called LG for little Gary, was born on June 5th, 1980, to myself and my late husband, Gary Hopkins Sr. He was the youngest of four. He was a very chubby child. Gary was smart. Gary was talented, the comedian of the family. He was fun-loving, caring, and was very free-spirited. He had such a great sense of humor and was always playing practical jokes on friends and family. He was a mommy-daddy's boy. He was loved by all. He was voted high school king his senior year. He was loved by all. In high school, he was on the wrestling team. Gary played softball. He was on the drama team. He often performed at both high school and talent shows. He was an avid lover of writing, poems, and raps. He was an aspiring local rapper and was often sought out to perform across DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. His stage name was Fats. He loved the supermodel Tyra Banks. He loved her so much his whole entire room was walled of photos of her. His favorite foods were snickerdoodles and my homemade goulash, which he used to take the Dorito chips and crunch them up in the goulash. He also loved collecting the little troll figures, of which his siblings still have and treasure today. At the time of his death, he was a junior in college, full-time student majoring in mass communications and with a minor in business management. He also worked a part-time job at a local nursing home. Gary was known as a mentor to his very own peer group. On the night of November 27th, at the age of 19, Gary was murdered by two Prince George's County, Maryland police officers following his attendance at a dance that was hosted by his supervisor at a local fire station. Just 16 days earlier, we lost his father, my husband, to a very short bout with terminal bone cancer. He attended that dance that night because he had been invited by his supervisor because he was dealing with a lot of grief for the recent loss of his father. That day, Gary called his friends, some of his close cousins, and invited them to attend that dance with him. He went to the dance that night. One of Gary's friends got into a verbal altercation with one of the other party goers. Gary, always being the peacemaker, broke up the altercation between his friend and the other party goer. When they got ready to leave the event that night, Gary was a passenger in one of the vehicles that his friend was driving. And Gary was sitting on the outside ledge of the car. As I mentioned, he was a jokester. He was always playing jokes, so he was a passenger sitting on the window ledge when an officer came and blocked them from exiting the fire station. Gary was in the lead vehicle of that car. The officer gets out of his patrol car with his gun already drawn. He comes up to the vehicle and he puts that gun to Gary's temple. Gary was trying to move the gun away from his temple when he was pulled off the ledge of the car by this police officer and spinned him around, and as he fell backwards, a second officer who was moonlighting that night made one fatal gunshot wound to Gary's chest, killing him. We often hear the stories coming from the narrative of the police officers. I will tell you that Gary was treated less than human that night. His friends were there. They went to Gary's aid because none of the folks there rendered any aid. The dance was at a fire station where they had paramedics that were there. No one rendered aid, but what they did do was take Gary from the arms of his friend, drug him to the side of the road where they left him there to die. The hospital was directly adjacent to the fire station, but again, no one rendered any aid to Gary. I'm sorry. It was later shared that there was a tip from someone stating that there were weapons, drugs, and alcohol, which we often hear the stories, again, the narrative coming from the mouths of law enforcement, that there were drugs, alcohol, and weapons in the car. There were never any found. There was never any identity of who this tipster was on the scene, nor at trial. Because some will say that my family was one of the fortunate ones because we did get an indictment. They indicted the police officer who did the fatal shooting, but they did not indict the officer that precipitated the event that night, the incident, that night. That officer that precipitated this incident was under multiple investigations for excessive force, yet there was no indictment. I later learned through depositions and trial that Gary knew both of these officers because, again, he was a mentor to his peers in the community where we lived and had witnessed these same two officers using excessive force against a neighborhood friend. So I believe that my son was executed by these two officers that night that were, neither one was on active duty that day. They were moonlighting at two different locations, but ended up at this fire station. So we went to trial, and after 7 full days of a bench trial, the judge acquitted the officer on all charges. Unfortunately, today we see in too many cases where there are no indictments, there are no convictions. We are now, as mentioned earlier today, that we are seeing some, but far less than what we should see. They say that there are 1,000 people murdered every year at the hands of law enforcement, predominantly Black and brown Americans. That would mean that Gary has been gone 23 years this past November 27th. We're talking 23,000 lives that have been stolen. And how often do we hear there are convictions or that there are indictments? Again, far little than there should be. We are asking that our system, where we're saying that our system needs to be overhauled. We are dealing with systemic racism and white supremacy, and we are demanding that the United Nations steps in and assist us with getting our due justice and accountability. I'll mention a few things that needs to happen, and not just within any particular state, but across this United States of America. We need to end qualified immunity. We need more and frequent psychological and drug testing of officers, not just when there is an excessive force case or there is deadly force, but they need to periodically be tested. We need to implement nationally independent investigators where there are officer-involved killings. We need to implement real citizen review boards without law enforcement on those boards, giving those citizens full investigatory powers of police-involved incidents. Fully eliminate, where they exist today, the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. We should also eliminate the good old boy network. We need to incentivize police officers that want to stand up and want to do the right thing so that we can shut down this blue wall of silence. We need to eliminate and remove resource officers, armed resource officers from schools, allocating that money to programs for our children, and so where there can be social workers and there can be counselors. Hire more mental health professionals to accompany law enforcement officers when they are called into crisis situations. Vote. We have to vote and hold our elected officials accountable, because a lot of times we see where the police unions step in, they fund their campaigns, and then they are held accountable to them. I would like to end by sharing that my son's, one of his final college essays was, "It takes a village." My biggest ask is that each of us leave here today being a part of the village. We can all contribute in some way to change things. Otherwise, sitting silent and doing nothing at all means that we are consent to the status quo. Thank you.